start with the basic question. Can global learning metrics be pedagogically innovative? Chris?
So I'm a philosopher of education, and I think I was invited here to provide a slightly different angle on these things. I'm not a comparativist, I'm not a psychometrician. What I want to do is try to reframe some of the basic terms in debates around big data and the accountability movement. So I just wanted to just maybe put a little pin in the idea. I mean, you're starting to see these books now that say things like big data, how it will transform the way we live and work and love. And so I'd like to just start by pushing back against that phrase a little bit and realizing that bigness and data in and of themselves are somewhere between neutral and dangerous. Maybe I'll leave it there.
All right, Radhika?
So as Chris was introducing himself, I thought, what am I? Am I a comparativist? What am I? But actually, I spent 25 years as a teacher in schools. And the last job that I had the very grand title of Director of Learning, Research, and Innovation. And so I've kind of seen innovation from up close or lack thereof from up close as well in schools. But I just want to say, Chris, that I actually don't think large-scale assessments and global metrics are actually big data. Big data have certain other aspects to them, kind of mechanized, kind of automatic collection of data and so on. And big data are statistical data, or rather global metrics are statistical data, and they are in fact not big data. And I think it's important to make that distinction. Big data, well, global metrics depends on standardization. So everything from, what counts as a student, what counts as a school, everything has to be standardized. And yesterday we heard, Sylvia and others talking about harmonization. That goes completely against the grain of innovation. Innovation and standardization, I don't think, go very well together. I think you can kind of reach some kind of, I think it can lead to reform agendas, but I believe the idea that you want to raise good citizens, that you want to value the whole well-being of students and communities, I think those are general principles. So I think there's nothing, absolutely, I feel that there are, you should be able to tell what is good practice and what is not. But I think when it comes to regulation, that is standardized not only in a country but across the globe, I think we might be interfering with the possibility of good practice.
I have a question, but if you want to chime in, Pasi, please feel free. Oh, okay. So next question is there such a thing as formative assessment at the macro level in global metrics? And if so, how do we balance formative and summative assessment at a macro level?
Do you want to go? You brought up formative assessment.
Yeah, it's a good question actually. When I use the formative assessment in this context, I'm mostly thinking about what schools are doing themselves, because I think it's very important that the schools and teachers have a kind of a real agency in terms of also deciding how well they're doing the things that they're doing in the schools. And formative assessment can be something that can, at the same time, it can be used as a vehicle for enhancing the professionalism of teachers or teaching profession. If teachers have this agency of being responsible for formative type of assessments in their classrooms. And at the same time, I think it can be, as it has been in Finland, for example, that I often use as an example, not to be imitated or copied, but just to use as a kind of a springboard for different ideas. In our system, people often ask that, so how did you build this clearly visible trust within the education system that is a very commonly visible throughout the whole system, that everybody trusts the teachers and schools, and whether they're politicians or parents or the community. And I think one of those things has been, during the last 25 years, kind of a very clear role that teachers have in doing formative assessment, being responsible also for grading their students, because we don't have any national standardized testing, we don't have any system that would grade or inform teachers how well their students are doing. So it's a sole responsibility of the teachers. And I think that this has been a very critical element of this trust building within the system that many people actually envy. People, when they come to see our schools in Finland, they don't look at the PISA results. they look at many other things, and trust is something that many people don't find in their own systems. And I'm often saying that, if you don't allow your teachers to have the agency and responsibility to kind of understand how well their children, pupils are doing in the classroom, this trust is very difficult to build. If they feel that somebody else will do this on my behalf, it's going against all these efforts to build trust. So for me, formative assessment is primarily a kind of a community classroom level thing rather than the macro level.
Could I ask a follow-up about that? I mean, I'm fascinated by the phenomenon by which we draw up these league tables, then get a sense that we're inadequate, and then it seems like take the opposite lesson that we should or borrow the wrong things. So maybe you can explain to me how when we feel these moments of, if I can call it PISA envy, and we turn to Finland and we, instead of saying, well, here's a culture, am I right, where there's as you're saying, there's a sense of the professional,ism of the teacher. Teachers can come and go, am I right, from, and they don't necessarily have to be monitored at all times. They might go to a cafe and prepare a lesson, or go home and come back to campus and teach their class, a little bit more like a professor. We don't borrow that. We instead borrow the idea that teachers must be more tightly, under surveillance and scripted. So I'd be curious if either of you could explain to me how we've gotten into a situation in which we're finally looking at alternatives and comparing ourselves internationally, only to then use that as an excuse to do more of the bad things we're already doing.
Okay, so let me, I hope I'll get a chance to respond to that as well, but I want to talk a little bit about formative and summative. And to me, it's not really the assessment that is formative or summative, but how you use that assessment that makes it formative or summative. So there's absolutely no reason why you could not take a TIMSS result or a PISA result and treat it as a formative assessment, because you see what can you learn from there in order to change what you're teaching. So I think in a way that's kind of supposed to be the idea of these tests, that they give you a snapshot that you can use to but in practice, that has not at all been how it has been used. And in fact, it has discounted even national assessments. We introduced national assessments in Australia. Every state had its own. And I think in part because we made it our national priority that we want to be top 5 in PISA, we actually introduced a national curriculum, a national assessment regime, and national standards for teachers. So we've kind of taken away all the possibilities that we could of local innovation and local kind of practices. And so when our NAPLAN results come every year, teachers are actually encouraged to understand how to use them, which is fine, but they actually are trusted much more than the assessments of teachers who see their children, who see the children every day, many hours a day, etc. And that is where I think the tragedy is. I think it's not trusting the teachers. Teachers are taught not to trust their own judgments, because this objective external test is going to show them something that they are not able to see, when it's right in front of them. So I think that's one part of it. But with regard to how are we taking the wrong lessons and doing that, I actually wondered about that. I think one quote from John Hattie actually talks about how he says, when people are looking to solve education problems and they look to systems and they look to curriculum and they look to all these other things, it's like the drunk looking for the keys under the lamplight when it's when they're lost in the bushes, and it's just the wrong thing. It's really only what happens when teachers and between teachers and students in a classroom that really matters. And I don't agree with that. I feel that it's not only teachers and students who are in the classroom. The world is not waiting outside the classroom door. The world is actually already in the classroom and off the classroom. And that there are all sorts of people. If only we could do good ethnographic research that shows all the hidden and invisible actors that are in the classroom, the policymakers who are there, the standardized assessments that are there, the teacher regulation that is there, the parents that are there, society that is there, poverty that is there, all of those other actors which actually also are interacting at the same time. It's not just the teachers and the students. And I think that invisibility and that lack of, being able to tell a compelling story about the complexity of teaching is what leads to, and of course, this other blindness that we seem to have, which is, so poignantly evident right now.
It's also known as more data.
There we go.
It's the same. Yeah, I think this is a great question. I think David Berliner spoke about these international assessments and their limitations and problems. I very much agree what he was saying about the PISA, for example, being just another standardized test with the similar types of issues. And always remember that the data from PISA, for example, only shows some correlations. And that's what people often kind of they cut the corners when they try to understand what we can conclude from this information, and particularly when it comes to education system in a system like Finland, for example. My argument here is that most people don't really understand Finnish education at all, even if they read my great book that you all should read. But you still cannot really understand by that, and it's mostly because people go and look at the classroom, they look at the schools and they talk to the minister and bureaucrats about these things, and they all tell the same story. But education in the Finnish context, probably it's the same thing here in the United States. David spoke about the role of poverty and the community, many of those things that people don't have. It's the same in Finland. Now, if you ask me now that, okay, so how would you explain, firstly, how would you explain these fairly high international scores in the former PISA studies in Finland? I would say that about half of the story I would tell has something to do with teachers and curriculum and schools and education policies and those things. But then the other half is a story that has nothing to do with education. It's about health, it's about early childhood education, it's about how people use libraries, what they do at home and so on. Mm-hmm. It's the same thing with now when the PISA scores are declining, not only in Finland, but in most Western countries. It's the same type of phenomena. In whole Nordic space is exactly the same. The results are going down. Look at Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Everybody's kind of slipping in this international study. And it's equally difficult to explain this, that why all of a sudden the results are going down. I have two theories for that. One is that there are certain countries and systems of education taking part in this international study that are really focusing on being good at these tests. They do a lot of work to be good, look good in these international studies. Okay? Then the other one is that in many of our countries, including mine, and here in the United States, young people, teenagers, now, today, as we speak here, they spend on average 9 hours with a screen, 9 hours a day, with the smartphone and iPad and computers and those things. And if you spend 9 hours on average with a screen, doing all sorts of entertainment or social media, whatever you do, of course it has an influence in how well you do in school. That time is away from reading books and doing your homework, whatever you do. And obviously, this time that young people spend, and this is my theory in Finland, certainly, is the major component that is explaining how kids do in school and in these tests is what they do when they are not in school. And that's something that if you really want to understand what's going on and why countries are doing what they do, you have to step outside of the education space and look at the things, what the kids do outside of the school and how they're helped or prevented from learning these things.
Just add one follow-up. I agree with everything you're saying, but I want to add one more theory to why countries, many of these countries are slipping in their rankings in, say, PISA. And I think one of the reasons is because of this very thing, because of what they've learned from there and all the standardization and all the kind of regulation that they have put into place in response to this effort to get a higher ranking in PISA. I think that's exactly what is lowering their PISA rankings, which is ironic and I think a good thing. Ultimately, I hope they stop doing that then.
So the next question takes us off in a somewhat different direction about the relationship between PISA, other large standardized assessments, and other structures in the classroom that may affect innovation and teacher choices. Our colleagues from the floor suggest that if you compare TIMSS and PISA to commonly used local assessments in some countries, TIMSS and PISA may look more innovative, less rote learning oriented. And if you compare PISA and TIMSS to textbook and course syllabi and standards, again, the textbooks and syllabi and standards may look more rigid than the international assessments. And so in terms of what are the constraints for innovation, what are the sort of key leverages, what are the most rigid constraints that you see, and what national contexts or regional contexts might be affecting what is the most rigid constraint on teachers for and schools for innovation?
Maybe I could defer to you two on this one, for starters anyway.
Yeah, this is maybe I start. You can take over from this one. I think one way to answer this question that we have in this debate is that yes, if you have higher quality, better quality tests, that it can improve and change the way the country's traditional, not only assessments but also textbooks and through textbooks pedagogy will look like. And this is probably one of those good things that has followed the PISA, and everybody here, I think you are very well aware that the nature of PISA and then the TIMSS and PEARLS on the other side, they're a little bit different. So they're different types of assessments, looking at they're using a different criteria. PISA being more kind of a forward-looking and focusing on what the children can do with the knowledge and skills that they have learned in the school, whereas TIMSS and PEARLS are more reference to the curriculum that they have experienced in the school. So if you take this seriously, then of course you can improve your own assessments and tests and textbooks that some countries have done. If you're interested in this at the level of the research, I was supervising or examining an Australian student last year at the University of Cambridge. His name is Simon Breakspear, and he did his PhD dissertation about this, that how PISA has affected national decision making. And one of the things that he found in this study that included all the OECD countries is that most of the OECD countries have changed actually their national policies because of the fact that they are part of the PISA project. And in many cases, these changes focused on curriculum and how they assess students. And of course, if the idea is to align the national tests and assessment and curriculum so that it would be more closer to what the PISA is, then some good things may happen. And this, you may call this even innovation at the level of the system. But then I think the other danger that colleagues here have mentioned already is that if we start to treat our children in a school so that they will do good in these tests, for example, practicing using the PISA test items or whatever international assessment test items as a learning material in a classroom, or training teachers so that they can teach to these tests, then I think we are stepping the line. And of course, some of those countries, if you read Simon's research, you also see that there are some nations, some education systems that are heavily focusing on doing well in the PISA study. That often means that the time and resources will be taken away from subjects like arts and music and social studies because more resources are needed to train teachers more in math and reading and science, buying more materials and other things. So I think we need to be very careful with this innovation thing and really understand what are the good things that come with these assessments and studies, and what are the risks and dangers for taking it too far. What do you think?
Yeah, I think I agree, except for one thing that you were talking about. I think one of the holy cows, there are lots of holy cows in education. One of the things that has always surprised me as a teacher is this idea that somehow teaching to the test is a bad thing. As a teacher, I feel that I need to know if I'm teaching something, I'm going to be assessing what I'm teaching, and why should I assess anything else? And if I'm teaching something, why would I not assess it? Like, what else would I assess? So in that sense. But of course, there's the extreme of it, which is if the test is not designed by the teacher who's teaching the course, if the test is designed by somebody else far away, if it's whether the test is good or bad, if all of those things are other factors. But I don't think it's the assessment itself. But I think there's a bigger problem here, and I think that is to do with a lack of clarity on what is the purpose of education, or rather maybe a very narrow view of what is the purpose of education. Yesterday, I think we had in the discussion, we had something about, that's really to produce a labor force that is ready for a global market. And I think if that is the purpose and that everyone has adopted that, then maybe this kind of education is fine then, that is looked at in this way. But if the purpose is kind of broader and kind of more robust or more, I hate the word robust because it's such management speak, but if it's something that's richer, then I think we might have more variety in how we approach education and what we value in education. So again, with TIMSS, on the one hand, it's kind of because it deals with curriculum that is common across many countries, so necessarily the scope is narrow. But on the other hand, they've done things like, first of all, you can relate it's a class, the unit is a class, so you can actually relate it to practices in the classroom, so you can actually get some value from there. Also, they've done the video studies and so on, which might add some detail and go into the small data part, which you don't have in PISA. But on the other hand, PISA, the items are supposed to be more innovative or more application-based, etc. But we do have other things. You mentioned the Japanese lesson study, and as I mentioned, and we're doing some research in Australia with the classroom with many video cameras, etc., which might actually produce some of that fine-grained information about how children learn and so on. So I think it goes back to this idea of really what's the purpose, and then if you are prepared to sacrifice a richer purpose and make it a very bland purpose, then probably you can do quite well with these kinds of assessments and kind of defer to what's put out by these.
And what if we're not willing to settle for that? Yeah. I mean, this question seems like it's the right question. What vision of the educated person is encoded in a given assessment? And it's quite possible that PISA has a less attenuated vision of the educated person than some local assessment or set of textbooks. But I was scribbling here just on a pad, I started realizing that a lot of times these debates take this form of someone says, well, don't you care about outputs? Don't you care about actually finding out? And there's this kind of truism, of course we do. But what doesn't seem that to always happen is the burden on the other side, which is anybody who is going to participate in the incredible expansion of testing, right? Not only expansion within a student's life, students opting out because of the incredible number of minutes of their life that's now about test prep or just actual testing, but we're testing and grading teachers with public shameless, we're testing districts, testing countries. With that expansion, it just seems like we need to remember the sort of slew of critical questions that any proponent of testing must face. And here was my quick list. Tell me, maybe these are all familiar, but it's just worth recalling them. First, do the tests even measure what they say they measure? Don't forget that basic step. Number two, even if they do, how are they misinterpreted or misapplied? Number three, what do they fail to measure? All right, so there are these blind spots to tests, and then perhaps even more troubling is that these blind spots in the test can then grow into holes in the curriculum as we are like the guy looking for the keys under the streetlight, so that it's not just teaching for the test in this moment of sort of an individual 50 minutes of instruction, but over time, the curriculum gravitates toward those things that we know how to measure, and we start seeing an attenuation of the idea of the educated person. If you asked an anthropologist from Mars, I don't know if they have anthropologists on Mars, but if you asked one to come down, okay, and just study us for a while, and let's give them a long time, a lot of field work, 150 years, 1866 to now, and then write a report on what is the vision of the educated person, not on websites or slogans, but the actual vision animating practice. I think you'd have to say, our vision of the educated person is a high-speed, pressure-proof symbol manipulator. And of course, that's not an educated person at all. So there is this danger that in going from the very common sense idea of trying to figure out if we're doing what we're supposed to be doing, we start actually shifting the system to something that is narrow or even miseducative. And that doesn't even get into questions about how to standardize tests, limit responsiveness to individual students or cultural difference, how to high-stakes tests warp teaching, learning, and the teacher-student relationship. And of course, one of the most worrisome for me is whether we're seeing a kind of discourse of meritocracy that serves to launder the money of inequality by translating differences in cultural and social capital into differences of effort and achievement so that we can justify taking people from the dumb luck they had in their family of origin, SES status, and putting them right back into that same slot in society, but this time with the label, it's your own fault.
Okay, so I want to follow up on both of your comments about sort of the directions that assessment and accountability-oriented dynamic can take, and also Radhika's your point, which I think in the United States, Lauren Resnick made this argument almost 25 years ago, that if you have the right test, you need to worry less about teaching to the test. All of this sort of presupposes a very linear relationship between assessment and policy and what happens in schools. One of the questions that a colleague on the floor asked basically talks about political shocks to what we think is important in education. The relationship, so the sort of, and what the difference is between the conference, this symposium, which was set up long before the election and presupposes, our discussion about global metrics. Whereas in the last couple of years, elections in a number of countries, the United States perhaps, Britain with Brexit, Hungary, and some others, are heading off in a much more nationalistic direction, very far away from the idea of international expectations about what education children should receive, or even the meaning of sort of global metrics. So how have these types of election results in the United States and in other countries affected the dynamics about the purposes of education, the purposes of international large-scale assessments, and what is the dynamic between those sort of macro pieces and the international discussion that we're having this weekend?
It's a very big question, but I'm going to have a bit of a go at it and say that it's not about how will the election results or the events that seem to be kind of oppressively nationalistic and so on, how might they react or respond to international assessments now. But I think they may actually be a result of a broader idea that I call seeing like PISA. I think a broader idea that has led to this kind of highly reductionist and highly stylized and caricatured versions of reality that have actually led to the election results that we're seeing, or the phenomena that we're seeing in different places. It's also the idea of competition, which is ingrained in league tables and so on. It's this idea of things being a zero-sum game, everything being a race. I think that those are all parts of this idea of seeing like PISA. It's the synoptic view, it's a totally fiscal view. Everything's about, competing in a global marketplace. And I think all of those have actually robbed us of a vision of education, of what it means to be an educated person. I remember, reading as a child in the former colony, India. Ended up reading a lot of stuff written in the UK. But the idea of an educated person was somebody that traveled overseas, and had letters of introduction to all these, major kind of writers and poets and things like that. And that's how that's part of your education. Of course, it was restricted to the aristocratic elite. But the richness of and the values of I hate the word tolerance because I feel I refuse to be tolerated. I want to be respected. But those kinds of things I think have kind of fallen away, and we've got this very economic view of what it means, what education is for. And I think that is the reason why we are seeing these kinds of very narrow ways of thinking, which I think should give us cause for alarm.
Can I just underline one point you made? I totally agree that a lot of times what looks like an international comparative gesture is all about a nationalist rhetoric. So We look at, well, our whole US educational history, right, is about Sputnik, STEM, Japanese car production, panic, more STEM, Shanghai math scores, or whatever it is, right? So we look outside in order to fuel this idea that we need to be great as a nation in the international arena. So they actually go hand to hand.
Is there anybody in this room from Europe other than myself? I'm the only, one person, two. Welcome. You're all welcome now, if you feel like going somewhere else. If Canada is too small for you, come to Europe. You know, I'm asking this because we have very interesting things happening in Europe. All the way until probably last spring, there was a very strong kind of a sense of community in Europe. Like, also when it came to education, although the European Union doesn't have anything union-wide regulations or directives for education, everything else is pretty much regulated by the union, but not education. And for a long time, we have had a kind of a sense of, you know, doing education together, thinking about what does it mean to be educated in Europe? What is the citizenship, European citizenship like? And I think that this is something that is changing now because of this kind of a inward-looking nations, including mine, that we have the same thing going on, that there are more people than ever before who kind of think that, you know, it's enough to be a Finn, that we don't need anybody else, we don't need to collaborate or, you know, see what the others are doing. And this may be something that will also change the course of, you know, how we think about education and how we do education within this community called Europe, that people think more and more that we will do our own things. And I think what has been a very good thing with this international study like PISA and others is that it has brought a kind of a topic, a theme to be discussed when people meet. In a good way also, to understand why the countries do different things in a different way, although we all have had a kind of a same type of goal of educating citizens and people for Europe. And I think that this may be something that we will do in the future less. I don't think that this will change. These political changes in the nation states will really change anyways how we perceive the international student assessments, for example. I think those things will continue, but I think what we do with those data and information will probably change in a way that it will be more kind of a looking inside and internally rather than using this as a means to communicate and collaborate with others and try to help and learn from one another, which is an unfortunate thing if this happens.
I think actually there's a little bit more space to have more productive comparative conversations than the history in the United States may suggest. You're absolutely right, Chris, that since Horace Mann went to Prussia in the 1840s, American politicians have regularly said, look at what they're doing, we have to do what they're doing, well, this little tiny selective slice. But I actually was fairly optimistic in reading this piece from the National Conference of State Legislators, which you consulted for, Pasi, where if you read it, the first two paragraphs are the standard, which for the United States is economically illiterate, claim that we must be globally competitive and education is the key to that, even though we sell mostly goods and services to ourselves. But the rest of it, I thought, was far more productive in part. And to the extent that you contributed to that, Pasi, thank you. Because instead of trying to say we must be like country X, there were a range of sort of, if they were object lessons, it was still a range of education systems, either national or state level. And I think that that's a productive, it shows that when you get even politicians who have very instrumentalist views of what they should be doing back in their states, it's possible to expose them and structure a conversation to be more productive than the zero-sum ranking or the let's go see what Japan is doing, which was the conversation in the early 80s in the United States. So I think there's a little bit more there is more optimism for conversation, I think, than perhaps what the history of those types of international comparisons in the United States do. I want to bring in a question I've been holding onto here for a while from a colleague on the floor. We've been talking in sort of with some concerns this morning about standardization, harmonization of assessment regimes. Really interesting question. How do we identify innovative pedagogy when we see it across countries? And does that imply that there is a standard for innovative pedagogy that can be articulated?
This is so easy question that I give it to Chris.
Actually, I don't mind starting.
Okay, yeah.
Okay. Actually, this was going to be part of my closing statement, saying, why does something have to be innovative? What's this thing that we're valorizing about innovation? I think the thing that we should be focusing on is this good practice? Is it leading to greater equity? Is it leading to greater well-being of students? Is it leading to greater learning? And I don't think whether it's innovative or not is a very good question. And the reason this is rolling off my tongue so easily is because when I was thinking of doing my PhD, it was originally going to be on school innovation. And very quickly I realized that I was going to be mired in all sorts of trouble if I went that way, because at some point innovation becomes reform, or it stops being an innovative thing. If it becomes global, it stops being innovative, because then you're learning something that's done somewhere else. So I feel that innovation thing, I think, has come from, again, the focus on STEM and that kind of discourse of countries being kind of innovative and getting better returns on their investment because of being good in STEM and so on. So I think that may be not such a consequential question, actually. I think we need to focus on good practices which are getting good results, and I think that you can know, that's easy to know community by community, whether that's actually affecting students well. In fact, actually countries collect a lot of data. Then it's not only international data that are there. In Australia, for example, I know that we have a lot of data that's besides the international data, even though sometimes because of aligning with each other, they might be changing some things. But yeah, I think there's plenty of, it's not hard to tell whether a practice is doing good or bad. And I think we can focus on that instead of whether it's innovative or not.
Yeah, I very much agree with this. Again, if you allow me to put my Finnish hat on. Again, in our language, we never use word innovation when we talk about education. It's not part of the conversation, and I think that's another word that is very typical in English language. Somebody told me here that you cannot really get any research grant or any money from anywhere if you don't use the title innovation, or you cannot get your research paper accepted to the conference unless you have an innovation or innovative there somewhere. So I understand you people that you kind of need to do that kind of a word of the game of words to communicate these things, but I don't think that is necessary. And I also say this with the kind of, I have this my own theory of action that is very easy to say here in the United States. I think that we have, honestly, that we have already invented about 90% of everything we need to know to make learning successful, and schools work well. And most of that work has been done in this country. So it's American research and innovation work that we know already. So I see a very little need for kind of a further really investment in innovation here. There's probably something there related to the digital devices, how we should treat these new tools in education. But most of the things, like teaching methods, for example, that have been primarily developed here in the United States, we know very well what works, what makes kids learn well. Like cooperative learning, for example, is a great idea of an American innovation that has been developed here during the last 50 years, really, or since John Dewey's time here, and much researched, and we all know that how good it is for everybody. But the problem is that it's not used here in the United States. And there are many of those so-called American innovations and ideas that are not used here in this country, but that same ideas they have made all the other education systems bloom, like Finland, for example. If you come to my country and you really ask the question that, so what are the key ideas and where they were made, that really underlie the good performance of your schools and teachers and the entire system? There's only one way to answer this question. They are American innovations and ideas. And you know, when people realize this, that Canada, Finland, Singapore, Japan, South Korea, now China, they are building their educational practice and policy on American ideas and research. I think the interesting question follows. So why the hell are you not doing those things here? And what I can say here, of course, is the same thing I always say, is that thank you so much, people, for your billions of dollars that you have spent on research that we use. And we didn't need to do those things anymore. And that's why, you know, I'm very sensitive to this idea of, you know, even asking about innovation, because I don't think, first of all, what is innovation? What do we talk about? And secondly, I don't think that the key is to invent yet another thing that you don't use. It doesn't make any sense here in America that you invent things that you don't use. If you want to help us, Finns and Swedes and Canadians, go ahead. But, you know, what you should do more here is to look back and look at all those beautiful, powerful, successful innovations and ideas in a history of American education, and then focus more on implementing them. You know, seeing how you can put those things, not in practice in one or two schools or districts, but put them in a policy that will then kind of steer and guide the entire educational practice. And that's the kind of a thing that you should always ask, that, so what is there in Canada that people were able to do to adopt some of these ideas as a level of their policy, entire education thinking at the system level, that you have not been able to do here in America. So my appeal here is to think less about next innovation that you will not use, and think harder about the implementation of those ideas that have been proven to work in other systems, and how you can make the better use of those things. Some of those people who have been working hard on these ideas sit in this room here. So you don't need to go far. Just you know, think harder about those good ideas and make better use of them.
Yeah, I resonate with both of your remarks, and it's not about innovation, it's about good practice, and I like the idea that maybe the most innovative ideas are hidden in the past and a forgotten history, as opposed to put an iPad in the hands of every student or teacher and then all will be well. Why? And I do think the word innovation is kind of it's a little bit of an Orwellian kind of word, in that it's a code for other things. So on my campus we have a new Center for Innovation in Teaching and Learning. Sounds great. Well, what it means basically is kind of pushing the faculty toward a kind of way of thinking about, toward online teaching, which is fine in of itself, but in particular through this idea that the professor provides the content, and then technical specialists will provide the infrastructure for delivering the content delivery. And as we're innovating, we're actually moving backwards in a way toward the idea of teaching as transmission of content, which it isn't. So innovation can be, it's either just nonsense, and we should realize that new is not better unless it's better, in which case let's just talk about good practice. Or it's actually worse than nonsense, it's a kind of code word for a particular drifts. The best way to sell certain ideas would be to call them innovative. One way in which maybe we do want to say, though, that innovation has been needed is, what would either of you think of this argument? That modern schooling as we know it was modeled on the factory, that was the sort of the metaphor. Okay, before my question is refuted, let me just finish it. In which case, what's needed is innovation, at least insofar as we rethink some of the basic grammar of schooling, this idea of transmission of content in cellular structured schools or something like that. First, the reputation of the question.
Well, it's what worries me about this claim that there's such a thing as industrial era education is that, at least in the United States and a number of other countries, industrialization stretched from the very early 19th century to really the middle of the 20th century in terms of, you know, changes in manufacturing and what that did to the organization of work and to social life. There is no one period in which you can say schooling is tied to this specific economic change. It is often used as a cudgel with which to beat particular practices that whoever is using that metaphor hates at the moment. Okay? whether you are talking about someone who thinks that there should be no academic standards and we need to go more towards not an unschooling approach. They will use industrial area education as their cudgel. Or if you're talking about Jeb Bush, who wants a very different approach, he will use industrial area education as a cudgel. And historically, it's not an historically accurate term in the United States. It is a rhetorical tool with which to beat educational practices up, and that concerns me a little bit. I think, taking the moderator's privilege here, that while I'm an historian of education, and I think there is a huge amount that we can learn, I think also there are still questions and challenges in education that existing practices do not touch. We do not know everything we need to know about how to educate children whose first and second, sometimes languages, are not the dominant language of power in the society in which they reside. We need to know more about that. We do not know enough about children with disabilities and how to guarantee their rights and educate them to the best of their abilities. And these and in other circumstances, we still need to know more. Speaking as an administrator at the US News and World Report #1 innovative university in the country, yes, I will acknowledge that innovation in and of itself is not sufficient unless it actually accomplishes aims and purposes. Looking out at my children's peers and children growing up today, and there is still a huge amount we need to learn and we need to gain knowledge about in order to figure out how we can maximize their potential.
But I think, Sherman, if I may add here, I hear what you're saying, and I think that it's a different thing to speak about education that will prepare young people for the world that is innovative, or to be innovative. And that's why I see, for example, this university that is #1 innovative university in the country probably means more about, how to prepare people to live and work in a world where they have to work and be engaged with innovation, rather than use innovations as a means to do these things. And those are two different things, I think. But I still argue that we know most of the things that we need to know, except those things that you mentioned and some others that we need to understand more. But other than that, I think the focus should be more on implementing ideas. Just think for a moment, you will have a new Secretary for Education, Ben Carson, here probably in Washington, D.C. Think about giving him your new president will give him $5 billion, the same amount of money that you spend on the race to the top that led nowhere, now according to the reviews, $5 billion to help districts and schools to implement something that you have figured out here to be good. Like, cooperative learning is one of my favorite things because it has proven to be so powerful. $5 billion in this country during the next 4 years to help schools to do better things with the cooperative learning. You could change everything here. Even if you wouldn't change any of these structures that are much more difficult to change in this country. But just, invest in implementing some of these ideas and not spend money on unnecessary, unhealthy competition that many of the other investments here have done, that none of these countries that have been doing well, like Canada, if you go Alberta, for example, to see what they do, they haven't done any of these things that you have done here during the last 20 years at the level of the system. It's more about helping schools and teachers to do things together, invest in social capital and collaboration rather than competition and racing against one another. And that's a kind of a big difference in the ways in terms of how money is spent.
Can I jump to your rescue, Chris, and say that, don't call it industrial, whatever, but there is a particular grammar of schooling that is widespread, and in part it's because it's, it's a public, it's a mass kind of enterprise, and that it brings with itself, with it in its wake, certain types of practices that might be pragmatic and some that are just a matter of habit, I think, that have just stayed on and we've never kind of found another way to do it or haven't bothered to. And I think that makes a big difference in how we conceptualize teaching and learning and how we conceptualize assessment and how we conceptualize even purposes or how easy it becomes to forget purposes actually when schools are conceptualized in particular ways. And that's never open to question. So I think that is a big phenomenon and if there's innovation that's possible, I think it may be in those areas. But I was also thinking about why don't we have more research about how people that have, kind of very varied backgrounds, how do they, et cetera. And that's because most of the attention has gone to major standardized assessments, and these cannot result from there. These kinds of things are seen as outliers, or they're not the normal thing. They're nuisances actually for standardized assessments because they don't easily lend themselves to kind of norming in some way. And I think that's the other thing that we need to think about in terms of what is not getting done as a result of standardized assessments, not just what is getting, what is happening as a result of global metrics, but what's not happening as a result of that.
Yeah. So we're getting close to the end. I think we have about 6 minutes left. So I will shut up at this point. And why don't we take a round of summary statements? And anybody who wants to start, please feel free.
Yeah, I'm going to read you results of the poll that asked the question whether can global learning metrics be pedagogically innovative. So there's a huge amount of voters here. About 50% of you people say no, about 25% say yes, and 25% maybe if something else exists. So this is the result. And with this, I want to thank the organizers for having me here. I think this has been a good conversation. I think all of these questions that we have had are fairly complicated, complex things, but I have enjoyed the debate here, and I have learned something new from you. I think the last point of this industrial metaphor for education is something I have to think again based on what you just said. But thank you so much for this.
I actually have kind of used up my summary statement and all the other questions, so I wonder if I can just thank, a long list of relatives and friends. No, I'm just kidding. So I was just wondering, I thought I'll reiterate this idea that we need to not really focus on whether something's innovative or not, really think, focus really hard on best practices, see whether we can find local responses to the question of, what does good practice look like, as well as using the global metrics to provide kind of policy questions, perhaps. Maybe not lessons for, but maybe questions that they raise might be worth looking at and then interpreting locally. And I think for any kind of, I think the things that are missing and that need more attention is, finding ways to really empower our teachers and stop the practices that are kind of de-professionalizing the teachers, and also being able to, I think that'll happen if you're able to value more types of evidence and not have a very narrow view of what counts as evidence. And I think if you lower the stakes, that goes back to the accountability question that you raised first off, Chris. So I think all of those things. So I think it's a bigger thing. I think this phenomenon of global metrics and what it's doing, actually I've been calling it seeing like PISA. It's this totally narrow, marketized fiscal view. I think one of the biggest casualties of that has been the rise of inequity in society. And I think those are really big issues that need to be urgently addressed.
Maybe I will just underline the worries about the technical conception of education that seems to come in tow with a lot of push toward metrics and standardized testing at different levels. And just to remind us that one worry is this idea that what are actually arguments about purposes, and often bad arguments, get smuggled into talk about what seems like just methods, efficient means to ends. And the second thing is just to stress this idea that teaching is a practice and human beings are sensitive to the descriptions under which their action takes place. It reminds me of the story that Michael Sandel tells in this great little book, What Money Can't Buy. He talks about the inhabitants of a small town, I think it's a Wolfenschießen, my Swiss, tell me if this is right. They were asked by some economists how they felt about the fact that they had been picked to be the town where spent nuclear fuel rods would be stored. Geographically, it was logical, and 51% said that though they really didn't want the waste near them, it was their civic duty and they would do it. Then they were asked, what if an incentive were added, $8,700 annual stipend, and instead of the number going up, it plummeted to 25%. Now why, if you can do your civic duty and be paid for it, why, if you have an extra incentive for the same action, wouldn't the rate go up? Because it's not the same action. The action of doing what's necessary for the good of the country and selling your town as a fuel depot, waste depot, are two different actions. And so teachers need, I won't say robust, but they need good, rich descriptions of their practice in order to stay teachers. There'll always be school employees called teachers, but teaching as a practice requires that we fight off some of the descriptions that would narrow the work to information delivery in the name of increasing the GDP, gross developmental product.
With that, I hope you will join me in thanking our panelists this morning.